Hey everyone, welcome back to this series of online devotions that we are doing here as Salem First Friends Church, and it's great to have you back for another edition of that. So I'm glad for all of you who have joined in the past and for all of you who are joining in now. And as usual, if you share what is happening on your timeline, if you're watching this live, then that will help other people know about what's going on. So I'm going to do that real quick. All right, and done. As usual, as we get into the devotional portion of this, we're going to open with a little bit of music to start, as we have been. Hey, Debbie. It's great to see you. I'm glad you're here. Man, my camera angle is just... Okay, that's a little better. We are going to get to the devotional component, and when we do... the one thing that I'm asking is if there's anything that comes up during the devotion time, if you're watching live that you have a question about, that you have a comment about, that you maybe want to know more about, just type something into the comments and I'll take a look there before we finish up our time together today. So, hey Jay, great to have you with us as well. So I'm going to grab my guitar for a little bit of flashback mashup music. If you've been joining us, you know that means I am looking at some older worship songs, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, which at that point almost old enough to be antiques. These are some of the songs that I started out doing for worship many years ago. So if you were around way back then, you might recognize these, and you're welcome to obviously sing along where you are or just enjoy. We'll fill the time with some music while we wait for anyone else to join. So these two songs today are both from the very early 2000s. One, though, is actually a remake of an old hymn from 1910. This one's called Sing to the King, and then we'll be going right into one of the earliest hits by a guy named David Crowder. So listen in. That'll do. So today we are going to dig back into this book. We have been utilizing What Did Jesus Ask? A book of short devotions that focus on questions that Jesus actually asked during his ministry, questions that are important for us to still consider today. The title I gave for today's devotion is Legions of Angels, because we'll be dealing with a question that Jesus is asked in Matthew chapter 26 when he is being arrested by a very well-armed mob, if you're familiar with the story. The question, as you will hear in the passage as we unpack it in just a moment, is from Jesus' own mouth, "Do you think that I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" So let's unpack that in the whole context, Matthew 26, verses 47 through 56. Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and this is in the garden. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. And with that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say that it must happen this way?" In that hour, Jesus then said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place, that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. So, thinking about angels and legions of angels, I was taken aback in my own mind at my own experiences of angels in popular screen and page and things like that. I was reminded of the television show that was immensely popular as I was in high school. Touched by an Angel was the name of that show, starring Roma Downey as an angel named Monica. It ran from 1994 to 2003, and of course throughout that series, Monica, the main character, is tasked with bringing guidance and messages from God to various people when they are at the crossroads of their lives and have difficult decisions that they need to make. One of the things I remember most was that those two angels, Roma Downey and her co-star Della Reese. By the way, I looked up all this information on Wikipedia. This is not my own memory. I wouldn't have anywhere near this. But I do remember they drove a really, really sweet car. It was a 1972 Cadillac Eldorado red convertible, and it was awesome. That part I remember. But if you remember that show, you remember that these angelic beings sort of went in and out of the lives of people to guide and direct them. Then I remember during college, I was presented with a book called This Present Darkness, a book by Frank Peretti that actually had come out in 1986. I didn't know it was quite that old. I thought it was released in the 90s. So it came out in 86. There was a sequel in 88, but it was a novel by Frank Peretti that was published and gives sort of a creative, fictionalized creative view of the world of angels and demons and spiritual warfare and things like that, and the interaction between that spiritual realm and the world that we actually can see with our own two eyes. That book sold in excess of 2.5 million copies, which is crazy to me, and it was on a Christian book top seller list for 150 consecutive weeks after it was released. I did not look up how many years that would be, or months, but that's a long time to be at the top or near the best sellers. So then I also remember one of my favorite C.S. Lewis books is called The Screwtape Letters, and that is a fictionalized account of a conversation that might happen between a senior demon and someone that he is training in the arts of tempting and tricking and testing Christians. And C.S. Lewis has a lot of different theological insights into that. And I don't think that either one of those books is theologically perfect. I certainly have my questions and maybe even disagreements with one or both of them, and obviously Touched by an Angel, same thing, right? But they get us thinking about the idea of the spiritual world that is around us that we may take for granted, that we may not think about on a day-to-day basis. I think that Jesus' statement and question about those legions of angels leads us to ask those questions. And I actually think there are several questions here built into Jesus' question. So here's the first one. Do we believe that there is a spiritual plane or a spiritual reality at work in the world that is influential even if it is invisible? And in this devotional, Phyllis Tickle, who wrote this particular devotional, says this. She says, "What has fascinated me since childhood, and perhaps, truth be told, even undone me at times, is the simple but central question that's stuck like an errant cord right smack in the middle of all of this." And she's referencing this scene in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus trying to pray and his disciples falling asleep and eventually abandoning him, and this crowd, this mob of people in the middle of it all. Do you think that I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? And then she writes, or better said, what undoes me and has for years is this question: do I believe that? Do I really think that there are legions of angels gathered there waiting to be called in to the rescue? Do I really, truly believe it? Angels are present throughout the pages of Scripture. I mean, from very, very early on all the way to the end. You can flip through and find them very easily. Old Testament accounts have angelic messengers sprinkled all over the place, especially with the leaders of God's people. There's even one epic wrestling match between an angel and one of God's chosen leaders at the time. Angels, though, were present in Jesus' story all the way through, from the beginning of the announcing of the incarnation to Mary and Joseph, to obviously the angels who declared the birth of Jesus on the night that he was born to those shepherds. Angels ministered to Jesus during his testing in the desert. Angels declared the reality of the resurrection. Angels nudged those first apostles into ministry and mission. After, in Acts chapter 1, they're stuck just staring up at the sky after Jesus' ascension. Angels and demons are mentioned several times in Paul's writings in the New Testament, and angels and their evil counterparts are seen throughout the vision that John had that we call the book of Revelation today. Ephesians 6:12 specifically says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers in this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. We did an entire sermon series last fall, I think, at First Friends, based on that idea that the struggle is real with the evil forces of darkness in the world. And there are two dangers with this, with overemphasizing the placement of angels in that spiritual realm. Sometimes I think people can border on angel worship almost, where we think and talk about angels more than we think and talk about the actual presence of Christ in our lives and the Holy Spirit, and that actually obviously is not a good thing. We want to recognize the presence and the significance of angels without actually tumbling towards elevating them farther than they need to be. There's also the danger of elevating that spiritual realm, which is very real, into something that becomes high anxiety for us, that we think that behind every corner that there is some demonic influence waiting to jump out and get us. So how do we have a firm but balanced belief in a world that is inhabited by and affected by these angelic powers? And how do we change the way that we live? And it's a question I don't really have a great answer to today. We might talk a little bit about it at the end, but how do we live in that world, acknowledging that it exists and having a balanced view of what effects it might be having on our lives? But I think there's more to it even than that. The idea of, do we believe in that realm, in that reality as a whole? Secondly, the question, I think, is do we believe that Jesus had the authority and the ability to command such a large band of angelic protectors? Do we really believe that Jesus had the ability to call upon his Father and to receive the support of 12 legions of angels? By the way, you're probably not familiar with Roman military history, but at the time, a legion of soldiers was about 6,000 soldiers. So Jesus is essentially saying, at any moment I could call upon my Father, and he would put at my disposal 72,000 angels. And think about that for a second. The presence of a single angel on the pages of Scripture usually leads to a person just absolutely bowing down in reverence and fear. 72,000 would be incredible. And it's hard to envision this, Jesus doing that. He doesn't do things like that in his ministry. He doesn't call upon heavenly assistance. He uses his spiritual authority to help other people, but we don't see him calling upon that level of spiritual intercession for himself. So I think sometimes we might be tempted to think, could it really have happened? Is it really a possibility? I think one of the important things to take away from this scene and the question is, in the face of what seems like a significantly powerful crowd made up of authorities of the temple and probably some Roman guards thrown in there as well, that they are intent on taking him away, Jesus claims a higher and larger authority than they could ever imagine. Even though he doesn't activate it, he claims it. It goes along with what he says later before he's crucified, when he's speaking to one of those leaders, and he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." He has incredible authority and power and influence, but he does not activate it in this moment. And then that leads me to another question. Question 3, do we understand the reason and significance behind Jesus' choice to not call upon these angels, to not bring down this band of angelic rescuers? Because if I was in his position, if I was falsely accused of things, if I was unjustly arrested, if I knew I was facing mistreatment and bodily harm and ultimately great suffering and crucifixion, I'm pretty sure I would have called down that kind of assistance and then some. Whatever was at my disposal, I probably would have called upon it in order to rescue me and to save me. And in just this passage, though, Jesus references multiple times that these things are happening for a reason. The story of his ministry, his arrest, his suffering, and his death fit into this larger plan that is tied directly to the Old Testament scriptures that Jesus refers to. Those Old Testament scriptures that spell out the story of the people of God and also God's plan for the world as a whole. And so Jesus refuses to call upon that heavenly force to rescue him out of obedience to his Father and to the plan that God has to save and bless all the peoples of earth that has been initiated since the call of Abraham. Jesus refuses to call upon that heavenly force because he has such love for all of those people that he intends to save, you and me and the whole world. And that lands us with question number 4, which I think is embedded here if we look deeply enough. Are we paying attention to the contrast between the worldly weapons that are being wielded here and the power and the presence of God? Because this crowd, we're told, is armed with swords and clubs. I don't know why, but when I picture this scene, I picture something similar to one of my favorite Mel Brooks movies is the Frankenstein one, Young Frankenstein, and the scene with like the pitchforks and the torches, right? And I know we're told that it's swords and clubs, but I pictured that kind of mob, that kind of angry and somewhat scared mob of people coming after Jesus. And we're told about the weapons that they're wielding, swords and clubs coming to capture him. One of Jesus' disciples even thinks this is the appropriate time to pull out his own sword. He reaches out and he strikes the servant of the high priest and cuts off his ear. Of course, we know from other accounts that this is Peter acting as Peter often does. Jesus is surrounded on all sides, his own side and the opposite side, by people who are determined to find their security in the weapons that they wield in this world. And yet Jesus chooses a completely other path. He refuses to engage the weapons of his opponents, and he harshly critiques his follower who tries to fight fire with fire by pulling out the sword and attempting to wield it in the defense of Jesus. And how and why can Jesus say and do these things? Because he has immense trust in the power and the presence of God, even if he chooses not to utilize that power in the presence of his foes. So I want to close by reading just a little bit more from the devotional towards the end. Some thoughts from Phyllis Tickle. What does it mean to live in an angel-infused, angel-inhabited life? What in a cosmos that increasingly is rendering up its mechanistic and mechanical wonders? I like that idea. We are creating incredible machines, bigger and stronger, more and more powerful. But what does it mean in that world to live as creatures who believe in both a physical existence and reality, but also an extra-physical, a beyond-physical reality that includes things like what Jesus talks about here in this passage? So 4 things to finish up. Here's one. I think that we can live in confidence, with confidence, in the authority of Jesus in all things, despite how things might sometimes appear. Now, that's what happens in this passage. It appears a certain way, but Jesus is truly the one with the power and the authority. The early church had to do this all the time. They proclaimed that Jesus is Lord in the face of a world, a well-equipped, well-armed Roman world that was determined to make them say that Caesar was Lord instead. They had confidence in the presence and power of God even when things didn't appear that way. Secondly, trust in God to protect and secure you more than your own abilities to protect and secure yourself. Not saying that we don't need to think about our own safety. That would be silly, and the safety of our loved ones, right? But we need to trust in the ability of God to protect and keep us secure more than anything else. We need to celebrate the love that Jesus has for us and all people. It was that love that allowed him to not call down those legions of angels to do his bidding, to take down his opponents. And then lastly, I want to encourage you to ask God to help you navigate the existence of the spiritual world that is very real, even if we can't see it, while also guiding you according to his still unfolding plans and purposes for the world. Because that's what we see in Jesus. He knows that certain things are happening for certain ways because it's the design of God. And yet he acknowledges the existence of this world that's beyond the physical, beyond our ability to see and hear and smell and taste and touch. And yet he knows that God is unfolding his plans for good because of his love for all people. All right, I'm going to check the comment thread, see if there's anything here. I don't see anything. Hello, Sam and Carol. Great to see you amongst the church family who are here today. So I'm going to call it a day at this point. So I'm glad you guys could join us again, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks for tuning in.